Good afternoon. Welcome to today's Brown Bag session. We are glad you're joining us today. Today we're going to talk about some useful information for you as a future employee. In particular, we're going to touch on topics related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we all know that today those are very important topics to be aware of and to be knowledgeable about. So today's presentation is about some subset topics from the broad category of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Today we're going to touch on identity, privilege, and bias. So to start off, I'm just going to show a couple of pictures to give you some ideas about what we're talking about when we're talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And even social justice is another term you'll hear. So in the picture on the left, you can see we have people watching a ball game, right? And in reality, it's often the case that one person has a lot more access than some other people do. And other people don't have access and would need some help to get access. So when we talk about the term equality, we generally interpret that to be giving everybody the same opportunity to achieve whatever they're trying to achieve. So in this example, achieving the idea of being able to watch the ball game. And in the second picture, you can see that all of our potential attendees are all standing on equal sized boxes. Okay, so that's what we generally refer to when we're talking about equality. When we talk about equity, then we're talking about making it possible for all the people to actually achieve. So you'll notice in our equity picture where that all of the heads of our observers are all able to see over the fence to see the ball game. In the second picture, even though they all had equal opportunity, right? They still couldn't all achieve the goal. In the third picture, we put two boxes under the shorter observer and no boxes under the taller observer because now all of them can still achieve the goal of seeing the ball game because the taller observer didn't need the help and the shortest observer needed more help so that they could all have an equal access. And then social justice says, take down the fence, right? So get rid of the barrier that's causing the problem in the first place, okay? Another way to think about it, if you look over on the right, this is the original picture comes from The Giving Tree, which is a book by Shel Silverstein. And this cover is very iconic, it's been around for a long time. And so on the right, there's some cartoons based on that. And at the top, you can see, looking at the original picture, that one person's getting the apple, the other person on the other side is getting nothing, right? So we have inequality, unequal access to opportunities. In the second picture, both our people trying to get apples have ladders, they're equal sized ladders. So we've equally distributed tools and assistance. Again, that's equality. It's like our three equal sized boxes in the previous example. But you can see that one person can pick apples, the other person still can't reach the apples. Okay. So in the third picture, we have equity. We have each person getting the tools they need to achieve the same result. And one person needs a taller ladder to be able to achieve that result. So now both people can pick apples. But finally, in the last picture, notice what they've done. The ladders are now the same size, but that's because what we've done is change the situation. We've changed the tree. So it's not leaning more towards one person than another. We've made the situation overall more equitable. That's social justice. So there's some first definitions for you as we start through our discussion today. All right. So I said we were going to talk about 3 primary topics: identity, bias, identity, privilege, and bias. So we're going to start by talking about identity, because really most diversity, equity, and inclusion issues begin by thinking about ourselves. So we have to think about our own identities, and then we look at how that interacts with the world, and that is where those issues of diversity and equity and inclusion and bias come in. So what is an identity? Okay. Identity is our memory, our experiences, our relationships, and our values that create our sense of self. Okay. And generally, after we've settled into our identity, we have a steady sense of ourselves over time, but we still develop and incorporate new things. So the values that we hold are what make our identity. And our identity helps dictate the choices we make. Identity has a lot of roles, right? You might be a student, you might be a son or a daughter or a sister or a brother or a grandchild. You might be a musician or an athlete or other things. So you have lots of identities, okay? And every one of those roles has certain kinds of meanings and certain kinds of expectations, and these roles evolve. Now, that's personal identity. So now let's talk about social identity. So this is you in society, right? So social identity has to do with, well, identity first has to do with forming your identity through 3 key tasks. So you discover and develop your potential, you choose a purpose in your life, and then you find opportunities to exercise that potential and that purpose. That's how you build your identity. And oftentimes, this is strongly influenced by our families, our parents, our friends and peers, by our experiences in schooling and other experiences, and by the experiments that we run during adolescence, right? The things you try, the things you explore. Now, social identity is obviously related to identity. Social psychologist Henry Tajfel conducted this research, okay? And he started with research on prejudice and then developed this theory based on that. So the theory of social identity is that people favor their own groups, even when those groups are random in a sense. So one of the experiments that they did, and this has gone this has gone on over a long period of time. But in one experiment, they looked at what kind of artwork people liked, right? And people identified with a group. They favored the group who liked the artwork that they liked as opposed to the artwork they didn't like. Do you like abstract art? Do you like representational art? Oh, well, my abstract art group is better than your representational art group. I mean, you like art, you like a kind of art, but we associate with groups and we then favor those groups that we associate with, okay? Also, some of our self-esteem is often derived from membership in certain kinds of groups, okay? So this membership, this self-esteem provides us with pride and social identity. And then it leads to an us versus a them, right? One example, one really easy example of pride and social identity is thinking about people who are citizens of the US being very proud to be American, right? There's songs, I'm proud to be an American. Okay, well, I was lucky enough that my parents lived here when I was born, so I'm an American. I didn't actually do anything to earn that privilege. But if I associate with that group and then favor that group, that may impact how I interact with other people, okay? So another facet of, identity is what the researchers call intersectionality. Now, you may have heard this word and had no idea what it meant, right? Okay? So intersectionality has to do with your identity in multiple groups, particularly if you're in multiple groups that are minority groups in some way, socially or culturally or whatever else. So intersectionality is the idea of using identities and how those identities interact and relate, and how they relate to social inequalities and social injustice. Okay? So as a student, you have multiple social identities, right? So some student might be heterosexual male, as this example, white male. Another student might be a bisexual Latinx gender nonconformist. Okay. You might be an upper class or middle class or lower class background. You might be underrepresented in engineering. You might be differently abled. But you can have multiple of these identities intersecting, right? So I might be white as part of what's currently the predominant ethnic and racial group, but I'm female, which in engineering is a minority group in terms of gender. Okay, I'm domestic as opposed to international. So I have an intersection of identities, and that's what intersectionality is talking about. And your identities don't function independently. Okay, so I have a friend, Dr. Yvette Weatherton, who used to be here at UTA, Weatherton Pearson, and she is African American, she's female, and she has a disability. So she has 3 different intersection identities that are all minority identities in terms of engineering. And she's a very successful civil engineering faculty member who just took on a role as, I can't remember what university, now I have to look it up. She was a vice provost at Rice, and now she has moved to another university. So how do we think about our own identities? Because until we assess our own identities, it's hard to look at how that impacts the people and situations around us. So this, and we're not going to do much of this activity, this is going to be a thinking activity for you to do. This is what is called a social identity wheel, okay? And it's one way to think about your own identity. So you can see on this social identity wheel that there are all these different categories that you might belong to, right? So you have an educational level, you have a gender identity and expression, you have a mental or physical ability or a lack of ability, you are at a certain income level, you appear a certain way, you have some role, right? A student or a peer leader or whatever else. All of these things are your pieces of your identity, and they intersect. So the first thing that you want to do in helping think about these issues is think about your own identity. Okay, so one of the things I'm going to recommend for you after this meeting is to look at some of the references. There are references at the end of this presentation and also one here that will help you think about your own identity. This wheel is one way to do it. You would basically take this wheel and you'd say, okay, what is my political belief? And you'd fill that in. What is true about my family? Do I live in, with parents and siblings? Am I independent? Do I have my own children? Do I live with grandparents and aunts and uncles and family and children? So you're going to have all different things in your social identity. And writing them down helps you understand yourself better, right? To understand your own identity. Because your identity then interacts with your social grouping and with your choices in education and career and so forth. So given the things you're thinking about for your social identity, now let's look at a few. This is just a sampling of facts about engineers, people in the engineering workforce. And these statistics are collected from a lot of different places. I've got references at the end. So the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics in 2018 estimated that there were 8,650,000 people working in STEM, so science, technology, engineering, and math. And that in the U.S. population overall, and I may have that statistic slightly wrong, but about half the population is women, right? And there's an increasing number of underrepresented minorities in the US population. So those are some overall facts. And then if we look at the engineering workforce, 84% of the professionals currently in science and engineering jobs in the US are white or Asian males. But wait a minute, almost 50% of the US is female, but 84% of the workers in our industry are male. 84% are white or Asian. Where are the blacks and the Hispanics, etc.? Second point, 18% is the number of women who earned a bachelor's degree in engineering in 2012, okay? That was the statistic in this particular data I was looking at. At that time, the statistics for Hispanics were only 8% and for blacks were only 4%. But Hispanics and blacks and women are much bigger percentages of our population than this, okay? Here's one that hits home for me. In 1983, 37% of all computer science degrees went to women. I graduated in 1983 with my computer science degree. 37% were women. And now there's been a 12% drop in the number of women earning CS degrees. 12% drop. We're down now, and that would put it at 25%. I actually think it's slightly lower than that now. Why have we dropped so far? Annual salary gap between male and females in STEM. There's an annual salary gap of almost $16,000. But wait a minute, these people are getting the same degrees. They're going into the same industries. And then there's a 40% percentage difference in the number of patents that are awarded to teams that have mixed gender as opposed to all male teams. It's actually 40% higher if you have a mixed team versus an all male team. Now, these are just a few stats, okay? And these are just to show you some facts about engineering right now, okay? And then for you to think about your identity and these facts. Where do you fall related to these facts? So now we're going to talk about our second topic. This is privilege, okay? Privilege is an unearned access or advantage that's granted to specific groups of people because of their membership in a social group. Remember, we just talked about social groups and how important they are, how much they affect our identity. Well, privilege is attached to social groups. It's attached to social groups not because you earn it, but just because it is right now, right? Having privilege means that you have an advantage that's out of your control and that you didn't ask for, but you still have it, okay? Privilege can be based on all kinds of different things: race, gender, religion, socioeconomic status, your ability status, your sexuality, your age, your education level, tons more, right? So, excuse me. So privilege can occur in lots of different ways. And it can be that you're privileged in one way and not privileged in another way because you hold multiple social identities, right? Privilege can be experienced personally, at an institutional level, and at an interpersonal level, okay? And the advantages that privileged groups hold unfortunately come at the expense of the non-privileged group or the marginalized group, okay? So within the US, Members of social groups that hold privilege, and by and large, in the US, this is white, this is male, this is wealthy, this is able-bodied. Those groups typically then hold dominance and power over other groups. Now, because privilege is unearned, you may not notice you have it until you start learning about privilege, right? So this is what you're doing. You're learning about privilege. This is key stuff for you. Privilege and lack of privilege are about how power is distributed in our society. My definition of someone who has privilege is someone who matches the community's unconscious assumptions. And that's just my wording. That's how I think about it when I'm defining it for myself. Okay? So let's think about examples, because you may not be sure if you have privilege or not, but some of these may touch you. So you may have an ethnic name, and then somebody says, oh, well, what country were you born in? And you were born, right here in Arlington. You say doctor, or you say nurse, and people make assumptions about the genders of doctors and nurses, right? An able-bodied person can go visit somewhere, go to a museum, go to a ballpark, without concern about how the sidewalks are maintained, or if the building has ramps or elevators. That's a privilege, right, for an able-bodied person. Light-skinned people can find products labeled nude or flesh that match the skin color of that light-skinned person, even though everybody has flesh, right? A religious privilege would mean that your work or your school holidays match your religious holidays. You don't have to ask for a special day off from class if you're in the privileged group, whereas someone who's in the non-privileged group has to make special arrangements because their religious holidays fall on days that are not in the norm in the current situation, right? It was Eid recently, and we had students who had to request special time off because they wanted to celebrate Eid, right? Privilege, this is a quote that I took. Privilege is your history being taught as part of the curriculum and my history being an elective. The fact that there's women's history classes and there's history classes, right? The fact that there's Black history classes and history classes. Like real history doesn't include women or Blacks or Hispanics or other groups, but it does, and it should. But right now, the way we're set up, there's some privilege there. This was an example. This is actually an English example. A female police officer who was wearing body armor died from a stab wound. And the reason that happened is because the way the body armor didn't fit her body because it was designed for a man. And so there were gaps in her armor that wouldn't have been gaps if a male was wearing the same armor. And someone was able to kill her because of that. Likewise, the last two bullets are both about car design. Early airbag designs actually killed some women and some children, small numbers, because airbags were designed with men's sizes in mind. And they had so much force that they actually injured and killed smaller people, women, and children who were not used in the planning process. Likewise, even though men are more likely to be involved in car crashes, when a woman is involved in a car crash, she's 47% more likely than a man to be seriously injured and 71% more likely to be moderately injured, even controlling for things like height, weight, seatbelt usage, and crash intensity. Again, it's because cars are designed with the norm being men. And men's bodies have different musculature. They have different height and weight ratios. They have different centers of gravity. And so the design of the car protects that body shape and not the body shape of a typical woman. These are examples of ways that there is privilege for the social classes. Now, did men explicitly go, oh, we're going to make these cars unsafe for women? Absolutely not. Nobody intended that. But because the planning and the crash test dummies that they use are all masculine structured, that's the way the cars are measured. That's the way the cars are designed. You know, there are women structured crash dummies that have more accurate musculature and so forth. They are still not required to be used in doing crash testing for cars. In 2021, all crash testing for cars is still done with male style bodies, not women style bodies. So there's a privilege there for, in this case, the male who matches the dominant assumption, right? You didn't ask for it as a male, but you have it because of the way the situation and the environment is, right? That's what privilege is about. So now let's go to our third topic. And our third topic is bias, okay? Bias then is an active, not necessarily a conscious, but an active inclination for or against some idea or object or group or individual. Now notice this is really broad, okay? Biases are learned. You're not born with biases, they're learned, okay? They vary tremendously. You might have little tiny biases, big biases. You might be biased in one area and not at all biased in another area. They can be based on anything, right? Socioeconomic status, race, ethnicity, education. So the amount of bias, the kinds of bias you have vary tremendously. At an individual level, if someone or something is biased against you, that can negatively impact your personal relationships, your professional relationships. At a society level, bias can lead to unfair persecution and even slavery and the Holocaust. Those are examples of one group having power being biased against another group and leading to huge societal impacts, okay? Another definition is a tendency, inclination, or prejudice toward or against something or someone. Notice you can have a bias for things as well as a bias against things. Biases can be positive. Okay, I'm biased against fatty fried foods and I'm biased towards healthy foods. I wish I were. I'm personally not. I love the fatty foods. But you can have a bias towards a positive thing. You can be biased towards getting regular exercise. That's great. But a lot of biases are based on stereotypes, and they're not based on actual knowledge, okay? Whether they're positive or negative, they're cognitive shortcuts. That's what a bias is. It's a shortcut. And it results in a judgment, a prejudgment that can lead to rash decisions or discriminatory practices, okay? So that's a definition. We're starting with the definition. Now I've got some examples, because a lot of times when we don't necessarily experience certain kinds of bias, we don't actually believe they exist. So I'm going to give you some examples of bias, okay? I pulled these from a lot of different places. They apply to different aspects. So I have some in education and hiring and promotion information. And I have biases of different kinds of groupings in different applications. So the first two examples are biases in education. So this is teacher bias, right? One study did an examination of classroom teachers, and they had teachers who graded their own classrooms as well as external teachers. And they had a set of math tests with boys' names and girls' names on them. Okay. And these math tests, there were some identical math tests, right? But some of them had boys' names and some had girls' names. The teachers in the classroom, looking at the names, systemically gave girls lower scores than the teachers outside the classroom. Now, you may be going, okay, well, they know the girl. But here's the only difference. The only difference was the outside teachers didn't get to see the names on the test. They just graded the test without seeing whose test it was. When they graded the test without seeing whose test it was, the scores came out equivalently across boys and girls. There's a bias there. There's a bias towards boys and math, right? Here's one on essay grading. Now this was interesting because the essays were written about computer technology, okay? Grading essays, and again, this is a group of teachers. In this case, we have identical essays. Some of the essays have male names, some of the essays have female names, but they're identical essays. Overall, the graders gave significantly lower grades to the female authors than the male authors. Now this topic, right, technology topic, computer technology is stereotypically male. And there's a bias there. The males got better grades on identical essays. It's kind of hard to argue that that's not a bias. Hiring. Now this one's really important for you students, right? You're gonna be going out into this. So I got 3 examples, I think, maybe 4. Here's one example. So this example was using Black and Asian applicants, and they had their resumes, right? These applications were sent out for a lot of jobs, 1,600 jobs, 16 metropolitan areas. But here's the difference. So some of the resumes had clear indication that a student was most likely African American or Asian. For example, for our students, that might be, I was president of the National Society of Black Engineers. I participated in the Black graduation ceremony, right? That would be a pretty clear indication that you're probably an African American student. An Asian student might say, I helped organize the Chinese New Year activity on campus. I was a member of Society of Asian Scientists and Engineers. That'd be pretty clear that you were an Asian candidate, okay? So they took these resumes and they had the original version with that kind of detail, and then they whitened the resume. So instead of saying I was the president of NSBE, it said I was the president of my professional engineering organization. And instead of saying I attended the Black graduation, it would say I participated in special graduation ceremonies in addition to the regular, right? So and I hate this term that they whitened them, but that's the terminology the researcher used. So the whitened versions of the resumes fared much better than those that included the ethnic info. 25% of the Black candidates got callbacks using the whitened resume, and only 10% of the Black candidates got callbacks with the ethnic resumes. For the Asians, 21% got callbacks with the whitened resume, only 11% got callbacks with the ethnic resume. Now that's a big pool, right? 1,600 jobs that were applied for across 16 areas. That's bias, very clear bias. Okay. Another study using resumes of men and women, 1,300 job offers. This was across a variety of occupations. So they had two different combinations of pairings. So one had equivalent curricula vitae, that's a CV, that's a resume, oftentimes a resume for an academic job. The only difference in the resumes were their gender, okay? And then did they meet the standards for the job, or were higher than the standards of the job? And then there was another set of resumes where the candidates differed not only by gender, but also by parenthood status, had children or didn't have children, okay? So there were observed differences in favor of the men, okay? That's gender bias. Interestingly, they did see that when the women had higher qualifications, higher than the standards, the gender bias was reduced. But when women had children, the gender bias was increased. Clearly biased. Two more examples here. Race, using resumes that were randomly assigned African-American names or African-American sounding names or white sounding names. The white names got 50% more callbacks from the same resumes. Same resumes, different names. The bottom one sent out 83,000 applications, 108 different employers, half with traditionally white sounding names, half with black sounding names. Across the board, the black sounding names got 10% fewer callbacks. And some companies were worse than that. Again, even though the applications were comparable. There's still bias. There's still bias out there. Okay. This one was about promoting people into jobs. So you already work for the company and you're going up for a promotion, right? So this study actually worked really closely with the group that was doing the promotions. And so the first thing they did was actually talk to the committee members of the promotion committee. And they had the committee members do an implicit association test, which is a test that generally gives you an idea if you're demonstrating some bias, okay? And in both of these tests, now this particular group was looking at science-related jobs, science research jobs, but both the men and the women on the committee showed an implicit bias towards men in science. Okay, that was in the test. They also surveyed people to get their explicit opinions, right? So they asked people, did the members of this committee, this promotion committee, were women impacted by discrimination and by family constraints in their careers? And some committee members said, yes, we know they are. Other people said, no, women are all treated equally. Everybody's equal, okay? So given that data, then they actually looked at who was promoted, okay? So looking at the groups that said, you know, we do believe women are impacted by bias in their careers, those committees promoted more women. Even though, like we said from the original test, everybody was biased towards men. But the committees that actually explicitly recognized some bias promoted more women, okay? In the committees that believed, oh, science isn't sexist, right? It's just science. They promoted more men, okay? In the second year of the study, this was more pronounced, mostly because they figured people had forgotten that they were being studied. So there was even more obvious bias in the second year of the study. Okay. All right. So this slide is a small subset of types of bias. Okay? There are lots of types of bias, but I wanted to just point out a few, because remember, we're trying to educate you to think about bias in a workplace, right? And things your employer might want to know about, and things that you want to be aware of. So this is 8 types of bias, certainly not a comprehensive list, just a good list to start with. So I'm just going to briefly go through these different types of bias, okay? The first one's called confirmation bias. And in confirmation bias, you're looking at someone else, okay? And these are biases that show up in a lot of ways, but the studies, these kind of came out of looking at the hiring studies, okay? Not that they don't apply in other places, but you can think about them in the context of hiring, okay? So confirmation bias is where one person has some perception about the candidate, some perception, often a candidate who is in some matching group with you, who matches with some way. And then when you're looking at the candidate, you look for things that confirm that bias, okay? So I think candidate X is a good candidate because they have this strength, and you look for ways to confirm your belief instead of looking more broadly at things that might disagree with that belief. You know, I think this person's going to be a good leader. Look, they were an Eagle Scout. But then later on, you see they've never actually held a leadership position in the 5 years that their resume covers after that. But you look at Eagle Scout and you say, oh, look, they're a choir member and they're the leader of the tenor section or whatever. You know, you look for things that confirm your bias and ignore things that don't. Okay. So you're not really treating that person, that candidate, fairly with other candidates. Okay. The second one's called the affect heuristic. And this one actually is because we're human, right? You have a bad day, you look at somebody's bio and you say, yeah, okay, fine. Great. You look at somebody else's bio, fine, great. But the next day you come in and you had a really great morning and you got 2 more resumes. You go, look at this guy. Look at this gal. She is fantastic. But the people on the first day might have been just as good, but the difference was in you, but it affected how you looked at those resumes. Okay. So your feelings and your emotions can bias you, right? So you've got to be careful. The third one, halo effect. We find some positive thing about a candidate, and then we ignore other things, right? So a candidate went to a college that you really respect, right? They went to the college your parents went to, right? Oh, well, ooh, look, they're a volunteer. My parents went to the University of Tennessee, right? They're a volunteer. They're a Tennessee Vol. Cool. And I look at that and I ignore things that maybe I should be looking at. Okay. So I've given them a halo, right? I've raised them up based on just one factor rather than looking at the other factor. Okay. Likewise, there's the horn effect. I see one factor that I negate. Ooh, they went to Alabama, right? That's Tennessee's rivals, right? Ooh, I don't know. They're part of the Crimson Tide. If I let that take on a huge impact, that's a bias, okay? Because I'm ignoring other things about this candidate, right? So balance. Balance is really important. Another type of bias, affinity bias, and this one is so insidious, okay? Remember we talked all the way back at the beginning about identity and how we, particularly for social identity, that we're part of a group. And this group's identity are very powerful and strong for us, right? So the problem with affinity bias is that we look at a candidate and we say, oh, they are a member of my group. And this other candidate, equally strong, is not a member of my group. So I prefer candidate A. But that's bias. It's based on something that doesn't have anything to do with the actual qualifications of the candidate, right? And it's interesting. So the details I have for this, you know, maybe they went to the same school you did, or they're in the same fraternity you were in, or you're friends with a friend of theirs, right? Could be something like that, but it could be a little tiny thing, you know? You both go to the same gym and like the same instructor in a class. I mean, that would be great. And if they did work with you, you could go to spin class together. But it doesn't impact how good an employee this person would be. So it's a bias. Yeah? The next one, a beauty bias. The whole society has this. We are biased towards people that we consider attractive. Okay? Now, maybe if the job is for a modeling job, okay, maybe that bias makes sense. For the rest of the time, it doesn't. It's a bias. So somebody might look good, but that doesn't impact how good an employee they are. I remember being in a team with a classmate, a very good-looking classmate, who was an absolutely horrible teammate. Absolutely horrible teammate. And it was frustrating because even I had that implicit bias, you know, attractive person, good, and they were a crummy teammate. It was very frustrating. The next one is conformity bias. Now this one's kind of interesting. This is a bias that the reviewer has, right? And another name for this bias is called people pleasing. So let's say you're with your team and you're reviewing these resumes, and you find a resume that you think's really good, really special. But the other people aren't seeing it as much, and they really like this other resume. And you have reservations, you have concerns about this other resume. Okay? But conformity bias says, well, everybody else is going along with it. Okay, I'm going to go along with it. Even though you really believe that this person would be better, and you have reasons for it, but they're expressing these other opinions, and so you just go along. That's a bias. It's a bias you are having with your group, not standing up for this other thing, not actually making the case for this other possible candidate. Okay? You're conforming to expectations rather than standing on your own. Okay? All right. And the last one on this list, not the last bias, just the last one on this list, okay, is gender bias, right? A preference for a certain gender. Now notice it doesn't say only this gender, because it can be in relation to a situation, right? If you're looking to hire a nanny, what's your default first thought? What's your default preference for gender? If it's female, you may then discount male nannies who might be excellent, right? So another type of bias. One of the interesting things here, this is some more details about this, sorry. It says gender bias is particularly complex because it's so pervasive. You, a hiring committee, might feel there's no good female candidates for CEO, right? Chief Executive Officer, because over the decades, women have had fewer opportunities to rise to the top ranks, which means it's harder for them to put together as good a resume as their male counterparts. So then you may say, well, this person wouldn't be as good a CEO. But you have to look holistically, right? Oh, well, these men have better resumes, this woman's weaker, so she's not a good candidate. But on the flip side, if she hasn't had the same opportunities because she's a woman, right? So diversity hiring and diversity initiatives in whatever you're doing is really important. That gives all your candidates a fair shot, okay? One of the interesting, this is another example. Ooh, and I'm going to run out of time here. So do we have questions? Is there a way to access after? Yes, we'll post the slides. Awesome. If there's other questions, Patty, let me know if there's other questions, okay? I was going to talk about one kind of hiring. So it used to be that orchestras were almost completely male. And orchestra directors said, oh, well, the men are just better than the women, right? They win every audition. We always hire men. Well, there was some belief, particularly in the women, that the auditions were biased. Because what they should be judging on is how well you play your instrument, right? So orchestras started doing what they call blind auditions. And the person being auditioned comes in, sits behind a screen, plays whatever music is supposed to be played. They don't speak, and then they leave, right? And so all of the people auditioning follow that same process, and the people listening, the people who are hiring, never see the candidates, right? So they choose based on the way the person played. And once they started doing blind auditions, the percentage of women in orchestras went up tremendously. There was gender bias. And that solved it. Now it's harder to do in some fields. You've written technical papers, your name's on these papers. How do you, if your name is Diana, it's difficult to take that bias away. But maybe when the hiring committee sees your papers, they see D. last name, right? They don't see Diana, they see D. But that means there's work that the hiring committees and that you as a person have to do to be aware of your biases, okay? Being aware is the first step. Once you're aware, then you can solve the problem. Then you can root out the bias, okay? You can address it. And these are subset issues within the bigger question of diversity, equity, and inclusion and social justice. The benefit for all of that is that the more people that you get involved in the process, and the more people are involved in all your aspects of work, the better your work ends up. Going back to that last statistic about mixed gender groups producing 40% more patentable ideas. Okay, the more different ideas you get involved, the better the outcome. And those differences are, obviously gender is a big one, but race and ethnicity and religious differences and cultural differences and ability differences and gender expression differences, all of those things matter. If you are building something and you include in your team people who have different physical abilities, you're going to build a much better product that's going to be much more usable because you've considered such a broader array of people who might be your customers and be using it, right? So, identity, privilege, and bias. Those are today's big three topics. Okay. I see we do have a few attendees. If anybody has questions, please put them in the chat. We'd be happy to discuss them.
So I have a couple of questions. All right. So can you hear me, Carter?
I can. Go ahead.
All right. So my first question, if we're a member of a group that people show bias against in STEM, then how would you recommend that we compensate for it in a job search? So would you recommend whitening resumes or degendering resumes, that kind of thing?
So first of all, I'm not an expert, okay? So let me just say that up front. I'm learning. I'm a student of these as well, okay? So based on what I'm seeing right now, we do still have enough pervasive bias that those might be strategies that will get you over that first hump, right? You've got to get a call back to an interview in order to potentially get the job. And if we know there's bias in that process of getting the callback, the things that you can do to jump over that will help you. My first name that I use is Carter, but that's actually my middle name. My first name is Janice. But when I went to college, I switched from using Jan to using Carter as my first name. And I remember as a senior walking into job interviews on campus and the interviewer looking around for the guy named Carter. And then all of a sudden going, uh-oh, Carter's a girl. There was bias. I jumped over it because my name wasn't gendered in the same way that they expected. Okay. Melanie, I'm going to jump to there's a question in the chat, and then I'll come back to you. So the question in the chat says, is networking a deliberate attempt to exploit biases or these type of biases? So it depends on what you mean by networking. When we talk about the good old boy network, that tends to be the biased network where people who are only alike support other people who are like them. But if you talk about networking in general, where I'm joining, so for example, you join American Society of Mechanical Engineers and you go to their professional society meetings and you meet women from this company and African Americans from that company and Hispanics from this company and men from this company, that kind of networking is a way to break down bias, right? Because you're connecting to all these different people in all these different industries and building a support structure that can help you get into those things. So I don't think networking in and of itself is pro or con. I think it depends on the network, right, that you're using. That's a good question. Thank you for asking that. All right, Melanie, we have time for one more question.
All right, so if we're a member of a group that has privilege, then you mentioned being aware as being a first step, but what else can we do to try to reduce bias?
So other things that we can do, and I forgot to show this slide, I actually have a bunch of resources. So I have some resources here that are educational, and some, in fact, are sort of training courses, short courses that you can do, both about identity, but about equity, about equality, other different types of ways to learn more and educate yourself. Okay, so being aware is the start, and then you delve deeper. The Psychology Today link at the top is really great for all kinds of definitions and links to other things. The UF workshop, that's a University of Florida workshop, they actually have a whole set of modules. The first one that I referred to a piece of it in here about identity, but they have a whole set of modules learning about identity and equity and so forth. The United Way over the last year put together a 21-day challenge, and actually it's a lot of different organizations use this. I know actually in Arlington they were using this. North Shore Community College has an equality and equity project with lots of resources, including quizzes you can do, tests about your own biases. The Diversity and Media Toolbox is actually interesting because it's looking at how does media also propagate or break biases and diversity. And then I actually gave you the 8 unconscious bias in hiring. And then the rest of my references are here. So this is going to be posted and you can look at all of those. But some of these workshops, especially the University of Florida workshop link, looked really good. I only glanced through part of it, but that looked like a really nice set of workshops, aimed at college students, right? Put together by University of Florida. So could be a very good place for you to get some more information. All right. And it is 1 o'clock, you guys. So thank you so much for attending and participating. If you've got questions, feel free to send them to me. My email is tiernan@uta.edu. I'm putting it in the chat if you're interested. And I will be more than happy to help you find more information and references. Thank you all so much for joining us today. I hope you got a little bit of useful information. And remember, these are things employers are going to want to know about. So I hope this has been helpful. And we look forward to seeing you at future brown bag events. Have a great afternoon.